Hi, everyone. I'm here to talk to you about the causes of the Great Depression and government's early attempts to resolve it. First, though, let's just make sure that we understand what a depression is. A depression is just another word for a panic. Remember how basically every almost 20 years in the 1800s there was a panic, or today we use the term recession, but it's a time in which the economy isn't growing. People aren't spending money. And this in the 1930s is going to be our country's worst depression. So first, let's talk about how this happened. Remember, there were some economic trends we talked about last week that are going to have a bearing on what goes on in the 1930s. Starting with in the 20s, remember a lot of people are buying things, especially Model T cars, radios, household appliances. And while that's great on the one hand, there's a problem because people are buying these things on credit, meaning that they're buying them now but paying for them later. And so as you can see here, 60% of cars, 80% of radios are bought on credit. And why is this a problem? How does this help lead to the Great Depression? This chart kind of shows you that. For instance, you could buy a radio on credit in 1 year. This is just a hypothetical example. Maybe you buy a car another year, but then eventually you have to start paying for that radio, right? And then another year you're going to start paying for that car. And then eventually, once you're paying this back, you're probably going to stop spending, maybe not entirely, but at least a big part of what you were spending before. And that's not good for the economy. We need people spending so that businesses don't shut down and we don't go into a depression. So the fact that so much was being bought on credit, that's what this kind of shows you that, again, even vacuum cleaners, other household appliances, you can see just put $3 down, right? And then you pay the rest monthly. So many different things were being bought on credit. And that's what this graph also shows you. In the 1920s, our debt goes up big time. And again, eventually people are going to have to start paying that back. And that is going to help trigger, not be the sole cause, but help trigger this long depression that we're going to go into. Secondly, remember in the 1920s, we talked about how people's income was generally going up. People were making more money. Businesses were prospering as people were buying more things. And again, that is great on the one hand, but remember, we also talked about this last week, that 40% of the country is not partaking in those increased wages. Farmers are suffering in the 1920s as farm prices were dropping due to diminished demand and greater supply. And so there's an uneven distribution of wealth that's going to help contribute to this decade plus long depression. And this next chart kind of shows you that. If you look at the red, it shows you the top 10% richest people in the country. And as you can see in the 1920s, that percentage is actually going up. So it's almost top 10% of people had almost half of the country's wealth. And then the blue shows you in 1930 here that about 90% of people had to split the other 50% of the wealth. The fact that there was such a big uneven distribution of wealth is going to help contribute to this Great Depression, because if you think about it, wealthy people, if they have so much of the wealth, they can only buy so many Model T cars, so many radios. What are they doing with the rest of their money? They're probably investing it. And investing it, whether it's in places like the stock market or what have you, isn't going to contribute to benefiting the economy. It's just going to make themselves wealthier, but they're not buying things that help for instance, keep us out of the Great Depression. So this is going to be a big problem that, again, looking back, we can see that the 1920s was already helping to spur this on. Also in the 20s, remember we talked about how there was a lot of investment in the stock market. As people started to have extra money, they're investing it in stocks. Remember, stocks are just tiny, tiny pieces of ownership of a company. But keep in mind, even though you can see stock values going up, you don't have that money until you actually sell it, and you got to find a buyer in order to make that difference. And the problem was in 1929, especially, there is going to be a large dip in stock prices. There is a crash, and here you can see it listed as Black Tuesday. There were signs of this happening beforehand in which stock prices tended to fall. Remember, stock prices are not set by the government. It's just based off of supply and demand. If a lot of people are believing in a company, if they want to buy those shares of stock, it's going to drive the shares of stock up. If people all panic, which is what happened, for instance, on Black Tuesday, and they all then start selling their shares of stock, it's going to cause the price of those shares to dip. And that's what happened on Black Tuesday. As you can see, one of the largest single day drops in stock market history. But the stock market continues to actually decline thereafter. Again, keep in mind, not everyone was invested in the stock market. But it's going to have a psychological impact now that people see the stock market take such a sharp decline. And here you can see, whether it's RCA stock going from $94 all the way up to $505 at the lowest point of the stock market crash. In the Great Depression, it's going to get as low as $17. And so this is going to trigger, even though not everyone was invested in the stock market, in general, though, it's going to have a ripple effect that people are spending less money. Again, if there's less purchases being made, that's going to cause businesses to shut down and people lose their jobs. So this is kind of considered to be the last straw, the stock market crash in October of 1929, that's really going to push the United States into this decade-long depression. But again, this didn't happen overnight. There was a lot of economic factors that contribute to kind of this unstable economy. After the stock market crashes, there's a run on banks. Literally, people would run to the bank because they were scared that their money might not be there. And if everyone runs to the bank at the same time, there you can see the outside and the inside of a bank. Banks, remember, are really critical because people put their money into banks. We need banks because then they're going to loan out those people's money so that people can, let's say, buy a Model T car. Buy a radio, invest in a business and, grow a business or buy a house, things like that. We need banks, but everyone got scared. They wanted their money themselves, but the banks had loaned out their money. And as a result, we see an increase in the number of bank failures in which literally banks shut their doors and whatever money you had in there is gone. In just a few months alone in 1933, 20%, 1 out of 5 banks in the United States shut down, losing the life savings of 9 million people. They don't have any insurance, not yet at least, that's going to protect against that. So this is, again, ushering in this Great Depression. Here you can see unemployment. It's typical for unemployment. It's okay for it to be like 5% or less, but as you can see during the years of the Great Depression, it is much, much higher than that. And Ms. Shack's going to talk more about this as it got as high as 25%. And on top of that, you can see that even in more recent years, this graph just looks at from 1948 to present. You can see that there are some times in which unemployment, again, that's the amount of people that are looking for a job that can't find one, that there are times that it got above 5% or even above 10%, although only about 3 times. But if you notice in more recent depressions, or we call them recessions, they lasted a lot shorter time. And so that's another major difference with the Great Depression back then, why it was so bad. How does the government respond to it? President Herbert Hoover is the one that's going to have to deal with this initially. He's president when the stock market crashes, which, like I said, is the last straw and brings on this Great Depression. He was kind of the mindset that this is not the role of the government to help people out in this way. People can choose to help people out, but it's not as though everyone should be, paying their tax dollars to employ people and open up new jobs, things like that. Part of the reason why he felt that is he was orphaned as a kid and kind of pulled himself up by his own bootstraps, going on to graduate from Stanford, became a millionaire, and probably brought some of that philosophy to the White House. There are some people that disagree with him as far as how the government should respond to the Great Depression. There's a group of World War I veterans that marched on the nation's capital in 1932 demanding a bonus that was promised to them at some point. They wanted it early, and the government responds by ultimately, even though they set up camp and they're there for many months and it grows to the thousands and tens of thousands of veterans that are there, Herbert Hoover ultimately authorizes the military to go out with tear gas and bayonets and tanks and disperse of those veterans. So needless to say, it doesn't make him out to look like the most empathetic person, and he will not be reelected, and that is when FDR then will become president. So hopefully that helps and kind of explain how we got to the Great Depression and just how great or how severe it was. All right, thanks, guys.
Hi guys, it's Mrs. Schacht here, and I'm here to discuss the effects of the Great Depression on America, as well as the effects on specific groups of Americans. And so the first place I'd like to start is employment. So in order to survive, right, in the United States, one needs a job and they need money to pay for the basic necessities. And unfortunately, during the Great Depression, many jobs were lost and unemployment reached a historic height of almost 25% in 1933. So essentially, 1 out of 4 Americans was out of work. If one does not have a job and doesn't have a source of income, it's obviously difficult to pay for basic necessities as well as homes. And so, additionally, this is going to result in over 100,000 businesses failing. The average income of Americans is going to decrease pretty significantly in a short amount of time. And of course, many, over 600,000, are going to lose their homes in the process. So, unfortunately, for many Americans, if they lost their homes because they couldn't pay the mortgage, many Americans created these kind of makeshift homes that you can see in this photo, using any sort of material or scrap metal they could find. And these little villages, if you will, of these homes became known as Hoovervilles. And they're named after former President Herbert Hoover. And obviously, it's a very critical name of his policies and kind of lack of action at the very beginning of the Great Depression. You're going to hear quite a bit about the New Deal and all of the programs that FDR implemented to address jobs and housing and farmers. But one specific program that I'd like to address here is the Federal Housing Administration, or the FHA, which was created in 1934. And it was created with the intent of providing Americans with affordable housing, requiring Americans to have a smaller down payment and the ability to spread their mortgage out over a longer period of time. However, one practice that was implemented with the FHA was called redlining. And this is a practice that's going to have devastating effects for years to come. And in fact, we actually can still see evidence of its impact today. So if you take a look at this map of Philadelphia in 1937, you'll notice various neighborhoods are color-coded: blue, green, yellow, and red. Essentially, if you lived in the blue and green zones, you were more than likely able to get a mortgage, a loan from the bank to purchase a home. However, if you lived in these red areas were considered financially risky, and many banks refused to give loans for mortgages to these areas in red. And every city had a map like this. However, it's important to note that the majority of the citizens in these areas are minorities. And so this is essentially denying an opportunity to purchase homes for many African Americans across the country. And if you look at some of these statistics today, you can see how, 44% of African Americans, are homeowners versus 73.7% of whites. And so, like I said, this is going to have some long-term devastating effects going forward in American history. Many American families dealt with a slew of issues during the Great Depression. Marriages were put on hold, so the marriage rate went down, the divorce rate went down. Unfortunately, many teenagers had to drop out of high school to try and find jobs to help support their families. And many men had to leave their families and find jobs wherever they could. So approximately 1.5 million women did not live with their husbands during this time. Additionally, these men, as I mentioned, would kind of hop a train illegally. Oftentimes they were referred to as hobos, and they would, like I said, travel anywhere they could to find work to support their families. The farmers are probably one of the hardest hit during the Great Depression. Not only do the farmers, many of them lose their land, again, because they're unable to pay the mortgage on their land. In fact, 33% of farmers lost their farms. But total farm income in general begins to decrease significantly during the 1930s. And a lot of this can be attributed to the Dust Bowl. If you look at this photo here, you'll notice this looks like a tornado cloud, and that's essentially what dust storms were. There was no rain, so there was a severe drought. High winds would kick up all of the dust and the topsoil, and towns across the United States would be pummeled by these dust storms. This map shows you that between 1930 and 1940, you can see that the area in red was the hardest hit by these horrific storms. Yellow saw a lot of damage as well, but just kind of an aside and a fun fact, these storms were so powerful that the dust from the Great Plains states made its way to cities like Chicago, New York, and even Boston. So this dust was kind of kicked out all across the country. Unfortunately, this caused many Americans not only to have, if they still had their farms, their land was completely damaged, but there were 350,000 farmers in Oklahoma that became nicknamed Okies, and they made their way to California searching for a better life. And the topic of a very famous American novel called The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck focuses on the journey of these Okies. So again, you can see just the sheer damage of these storms among American farmers. I do want to talk specifically about a few more groups. So the first is women. There are some great strides that are made during this time, but there are also some challenges that women still face. One great kind of milestone is that Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed Frances Perkins as his Secretary of Labor, and she becomes the first woman to hold a cabinet position. You also have this lady here, First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who really was considered to be the first lady to actively participate in politics. On top of that, there were some women that were employed by New Deal programs. The Works Progress Administration, or the WPA, employed over 400,000 women. However, most other programs excluded women. And even though some women saw gains in employment, we're going to see even larger gains, when America enters World War II. And once again, women will enter the workforce by the millions and help the war effort. African Americans kind of see the same trends. There are some great strides made, but civil rights and full equality is not something that the New Deal addresses during this time period. Approximately 18% of WPA jobs, or Works Progress Administration jobs, were held by African Americans, and FDR did appoint some African Americans to various New Deal programs to help him run them. However, like I said, full equality and civil rights is not something that is addressed or achieved during this time period. Despite all of that, many African Americans do support FDR politically. And something that shifts during this time is who supports the Democratic Party. And many historians refer to this as the New Deal coalition. So I want to talk about just a couple of these groups, but if you think about it, many African Americans supported Republicans during and after the Civil War, specifically the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln. But what you're going to start to see is a shift of who supports Democrats and who supports Republicans. And you're going to see some new groups beginning to support Democratic candidates. Many white Southerners, specifically Southern farmers, are going to start to support FDR and Democratic candidates for all that he does for farmers. Labor unions do see an increase in membership, so many members of labor unions will support FDR and Democratic candidates. Many African Americans and women and kind of progressives will do so as well. And so you start to see a shift of the types of Americans who support Democratic candidates. And for the most part, from Roosevelt's presidency all the way through approximately 1968, Democrats will dominate the presidency, the only exception being Dwight D. Eisenhower, who serves during the 1950s. So this kind of shift of who supports Democrats and this dominance of the Democratic Party for the next 30, 40 years is known as the New Deal coalition. Additionally, Native Americans actually do see some gains and some changes during this time period. There was a Bureau of Indian Affairs created in 1933, and one impact of that was the Indian Reorganization Act, which was created in 1934. This basically repealed the Dawes Act from previous chapters, if you guys remember. It returned land to Native American tribes, and it basically allowed Native Americans to preserve their culture and to return to their land, their culture, and try and improve upon that land. And so many Native American tribes were given full autonomy over their land. And then the last group I'd like to speak about are Mexican Americans. So many Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants worked specifically in agricultural jobs, a lot in California and out west. And with the decrease in farming prices and the high rates of unemployment, one government program that's pretty controversial is one that becomes known as Mexican repatriation. And essentially, our government deported over 500,000 Mexican American citizens and immigrants back to Mexico so that there were more jobs available for Americans. And it's important to note that of those who were deported, 60% were actually legal citizens of our country. And so this is obviously a very devastating impact. Again, this is known as Mexican repatriation. This will change with World War II and will kind of reopen jobs to Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants. But like I said, over 500,000 were deported during this time. So guys, that is a lot. I hope you can see just how many groups of people were impacted in very different ways throughout the Great Depression. And I hope
Hi, everyone. In 1932, Americans went to the polls to cast their ballots for the President of the United States amidst the worst economic downturn in history. The Great Depression had battered the country, leaving over 15 million people unemployed. With over a quarter of the U.S. population jobless, the national mood was one of horrible despair. The man who the people chose to lead them was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR for short. Roosevelt had risen to political prominence as the governor of New York, and now in 1932, he captured the imagination of the public by preaching a New Deal for the American people. The New Deal began as a vague series of promises to improve the lives of the people. However, over the course of FDR's administration, it would begin to take shape with the help of reform-minded advisors such as FDR's cabinet and the Brain Trust. Now, the Brain Trust was a group of intellectuals, many of them college professors, who worked with Roosevelt to develop the policies that collectively became known as the New Deal. From the start, the New Deal was less a comprehensive plan and more of a series of experiments designed to battle the Great Depression. Some of it worked and some of it didn't, but all of it would redefine the role of government in the lives of the American people and establish a limited welfare state within America. When Roosevelt was inaugurated in March of 1933, he faced perhaps the greatest crisis in American history since the Civil War. The Great Depression was in its third year, and many wondered if it would ever end. Indeed, the Great Depression threatened to upend American democracy itself, and there were fears that fascism or communism would take over in the United States. Franklin Roosevelt seemed uniquely suited to handle the challenges of the Great Depression. First, because he had overcome struggles within his own life, most notably a bout with polio in 1921 that left him paralyzed from the waist down. Recovering from polio had humbled Roosevelt and instilled in him a strong sense of compassion and determination. FDR was also aided by his wife, Eleanor. Eleanor Roosevelt would become the most active First Lady in American history. As the conscience of the New Deal, Eleanor Roosevelt traveled across the country, visiting government institutions and New Deal program sites. She served as the eyes and ears of the president and pushed the president to take greater measures to help all Americans, advocating for civil rights for African Americans, promoting additional aid to the poor, and championing greater inclusion for women within the government. She would regularly hold press conferences in which she only invited female reporters, since female reporters were not allowed at the president's briefings. And Eleanor Roosevelt wrote a weekly syndicated newspaper entitled My Day, which gave her a platform to discuss topics that she cared about. Eleanor and FDR's political partnership would greatly influence the programs created by the New Deal. Now, upon taking office, FDR moved very quickly to pass legislation that would alleviate the economic burdens created by the Great Depression. Drawing ideas from earlier progressive movements, Congress passed over 15 pieces of major legislation in the first 100 days of FDR's presidency. Never before in American history had Congress been so active. This legislation would become some of the cornerstones of the New Deal and set the tone for the governmental experimentation, which would become a hallmark of the Roosevelt administration. There were a number of programs that were created in the first 100 days, including the CCC, the TVA, NRA, and AAA. Sometimes we call these programs the alphabet soup of government because they contain so many acronyms. These programs are important, and so I'm going to highlight a few of them, organizing them by the problems in which they were meant to solve. Together, these programs, which were all created between 1933 and 1935, will become known as the First New Deal. We will discuss the later New Deal programs in another lecture. So perhaps the most immediate crisis facing the country in 1933 was the collapse of American financial institutions. By 1933, over 5,000 banks had failed and 9 million savings accounts were wiped out in the process. The nation had grown to mistrust the banking system, choosing to hoard money and hide it under their mattresses instead of depositing it in savings accounts. If FDR was to get the United States out of the Great Depression, he would first have to restore the faith in its financial institutions. One of the first acts that was passed by Congress as part of the New Deal was the Emergency Banking Relief Act, sometimes referred to as the bank holiday. As part of the bank holiday, all banks were closed across the country for a period of 4 days, beginning in March of 1933. As part of the act, the government was authorized to examine the finances of banks closed during the bank holiday and reopen those judged to be sound, hopefully in the process reestablishing the public's confidence in the American banking system. In order to do this, Roosevelt used the radio to directly appeal to the American people. In what became known as his fireside chats, Roosevelt broadcast his plan to save the banks to an audience of 35 million people. In his first fireside chat, he gave assurances to the American people that the government was doing what it could to protect their money. His talk eased their fears, and when many of the banks reopened, the public responded by depositing their money back in the banks. These fireside chats would continue throughout his presidency, and Roosevelt's informal addresses over the radio would create a connection between him and the American public. While the Emergency Banking Relief Act prevented America's financial systems from collapsing, FDR still wanted to prevent future bank runs that might jeopardize America's money. Therefore, the government next passed the Glass-Steagall Banking Reform Act. The Glass-Steagall Act established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, to insure individual bank deposits up to $5,000. The creation of the FDIC ended the bank runs that had occurred frequently at the start of the Great Depression and had led to many of the costly bank failures. The FDIC is still around today and currently insures deposits up to $250,000. Since the start of this program, no depositor has lost any insured funds as a result of a bank failure. Another major action designed to address the financial crisis was the creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, in 1934. Many continued to view the largely unregulated stock market and its collapse as a main cause of the Great Depression. Prior to the SEC, the stock market operated more like a casino than a legitimate trading market, with brokers allowing investors to buy stock on a margin and many engaging in insider trading. The SEC served as a watchdog agency, which helped regulate the trading of stocks. The Securities and Exchange Commission still serves that purpose today. And since its creation, companies publicly offering stocks must tell the public the truth about their businesses, the stocks they are selling, and the risks involved in investing. The result is a stock market where investors are treated more fairly and honestly. Now, a second major issue that the New Deal sought to address was the large percentage of Americans who were unemployed. With 1 in 4 Americans out of work, the United States faced the highest levels of joblessness in the nation's history. Roosevelt began to create programs that used federal money to put Americans back to work and at the same time stimulate American industry. One of the first programs passed by Congress to deal with this issue was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. Incredibly popular in its day, the CCC employed young men ages 18 to 25 to work outdoors doing conservation work. During the life of the program, 3 million men would serve in Roosevelt's Tree Army, as the organization came to be called. These men planted hundreds of millions of trees, built fire towers, restocked depleted streams, and maintained the nation's parks, forests, and historic sites. Participants were able to earn $30 a month, much of which they sent back home to their parents. But unfortunately, the limited scope of the CCC meant that it barely made a dent in the unemployment rate at the time. A much more ambitious program was the National Recovery Administration, or NRA. The NRA sought to help the unemployed while simultaneously promoting better labor conditions and helping industry. The main idea behind the NRA was that the government, businesses, and laborers would work together to establish fair competition among all of the different parties. The hope was that the NRA could work with businesses to keep wages high while at the same time keeping the prices of their products low. Some of the policies worked out by the NRA included setting maximum hours for labor, establishing a minimum wage, and guaranteeing workers the right to unionize and bargain collectively. At first, the program was very popular, with participating businesses displaying posters that featured a blue eagle on them and a slogan that read, "We do our part." The enthusiasm for the program was so high that a newly formed professional football team in Philadelphia even made their mascot the Eagles. However, the NRA ultimately failed in its mission to bring about long-term recovery. Those involved in the program were asked to sacrifice too much, and the NRA completely collapsed when the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional in 1935 on the grounds that Congress had delegated legislative powers to the executive branch. The demise of the NRA was a major blow to the New Deal and would mark the beginning of an ongoing struggle between FDR and the more conservative Supreme Court. Now, a third major issue that the New Deal sought to fix was the continued struggles of American farmers. Ever since the end of World War I, farmers had been struggling as a result of falling farm prices. Farm income fell by a staggering 2/3 during the Depression's first 3 years. A bushel of wheat that sold for $2.94 in 1920 dropped to $1 in 1929 and 30 cents in 1932. Farm foreclosures had risen steadily throughout the 1920s, and that trend continued during the Great Depression. The farmers' problem, ironically, was that they grew too much. Widespread crop production soared, but demand fell, causing prices to fall. The dust storms of the 1930s did not help matters. Thus, the government tried to create a program that would increase farm prices so that farmers could more easily support themselves. FDR's solution was the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, or AAA. Under the AAA, the government tried to raise prices by reducing the supply of farm goods. Farmers were paid by the government to plow under parts of their crops, and the government purchased livestock to slaughter. The program proved very controversial. Critics of the AAA wondered why food was being destroyed while thousands of citizens went hungry. Yet, as a result of the work of the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, farm prices did begin to rise. Farm incomes doubled between 1933 and 1936, but large farmers reaped most of these benefits. Like the NRA, The AAA was deemed unconstitutional in 1935 by the Supreme Court. But the program was monumental because it established the precedent for a system of farm subsidies, which still exists today. Now, the defunct AAA was replaced by the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act of 1936, which helped prevent overproduction of farmlands by paying farmers to plant soil-conserving crops or leaving some parts of their lands completely uncultivated. Another law that was designed to help Americans in rural areas was the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA. Prior to the New Deal, the Tennessee River Valley region was without electricity and had depleted resources, thus making the area economically depressed. Unfortunately, this was a trend throughout much of rural America in the 1930s. As late as 1935, more than 6 million of America's 6.8 million farmers had no electricity. Unlike Americans living in cities, rural families had not benefited from the growing consumerism of the 1920s, and very few farmers owned washing machines, refrigerators, or vacuum cleaners. Private companies insisted that it would be too expensive to provide electrical service to many of these rural areas. Roosevelt disagreed and started the Tennessee Valley Authority, which became a model for federally guided resource management. The TVA was authorized to build 21 dams to generate electricity for tens of thousands of farm families. Rural electrification programs meant that for the first time, Americans in Appalachia, the Texas Hill Country, and other areas would have the opportunity to share in the benefits of electric lights and running water. The TVA had an added bonus of creating jobs in the construction of these hydroelectric dams. As a result of the program, the government was able to provide cheap electricity to families in the Tennessee River Valley region, create better systems of flood control in the area as well, and conserve the environment of the Tennessee Valley by restoring some of its eroded soil. The TVA served as a model for other resource management programs out west on the Columbia, Missouri, and Colorado rivers. These projects would significantly increase the irrigation systems in the west and allow for its expansion as the 20th century continued. Now, these programs only represent a small portion of the legislation passed during the first New Deal. The New Deal would continue to experiment with other solutions to the Great Depression for the rest of the decade. These New Deal programs were aimed at achieving what FDR called the 3 Rs: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief for those who were suffering from the Great Depression, recovery so that our economy could get back on its feet, and reform so that the Great Depression would never happen again. The 3 Rs often overlapped and sometimes even got in each other's way. But one thing is for sure. The New Deal and its objectives completely shifted the role of government in the lives of the people. Prior to the New Deal, the federal government existed to defend the country from outside threats, deliver the mail, protect basic rights, and for the most part, stay out of the way. FDR's New Deal changed the role of the federal government by making it responsible for the material well-being of the American people. This is the beginning of the social safety net within the United States, which still exists today. Take care.
Happy days are here again, the skies above are clear.
Welcome back. Today's video is on the second New Deal of FDR. So you already did the heavy lifting with the first New Deal. There's a lot more programs to know. You talked about the first 100 days, talked about the bank holiday, FDIC, SEC, AAA, CCC, TVA, PWA, CWA. This video is much simpler. You'll have to know the Social Security Act, the WPA, the Wagner Act, and ultimately that there are critiques of FDR and his New Deal, and he will somewhat address them. A hallmark of the first New Deal was deficit spending. The government was spending way more on work programs and whatnot than it was taking in income taxes and tariffs. FDR will keep this going. And he does question it at one point, thinking maybe balancing the budget would be important. But he reads the work of British economist John Maynard Keynes, who suggests the government's responsibility in an economic downturn is to deficit spend, is to pump more money into unemployment or trying to get people employed, to cut taxes, to try to stimulate spending. These are things the government should do. So what is FDR dumping all this money on in the second New Deal?
The Works Progress Administration was launched late in 1935 as the key agency in the federal work program to employ able people from relief roles.
$11 billion will be spent on the Works Progress Administration from 1935 to 1942 alone. But the payoff will be huge. 8.5 million Americans will be employed by the WPA. So they'll do the infrastructure, they'll do the roads and the bridges and the dams again, but it's also going to be funding artists and writers and photographers and musicians and teachers and scholars to do what they do best as well. For example, you've got community concerts put on, community theater, you have seminars. A much broader scope of things are being directly funded by the federal government through the WPA. Does it pay well to work for the WPA? Well, kind of, sort of. So you're making 2 times that of what the relief payments would have been if you were out of work, but at the same rate, you aren't making as much as a typical worker. There's a really neat site. It's called The Living New Deal, and they have put most of these projects that were funded by the WPA, but also like the CCC and the CWA and other work projects. Pretty cool site. The QR code there should take you to it if you're interested. But you can see here, Swallow Cliff was built by the CCC specifically. A monumental victory for workers during the Second New Deal is the Wagner Act, or the National Labor Relations Act. And this is passed in 1935. The main things it does is protect unions forming. So unions are protected. You could join a union. Prior to this, you could be blacklisted, or employers could do all sorts of things to try to make you leave that union or prevent you from joining it in the first place. Union membership was around 3 million prior to this Wagner Act. After the Wagner Act, we're going to see union membership rise to about 10 million Americans by 1940. The Wagner Act also makes collective bargaining completely legitimate. So this is where a union is going to have some representatives that go to the boss, go to the employer, and on the behalf of the union members are going to compromise and negotiate. The National Labor Relations Board is created as well in order to further investigate unfair practices of employers on their labor. During the Second New Deal, you're also going to see Social Security created.
This Social Security measure gives at least some protection to 30 millions of our citizens who will reap direct benefits through unemployment compensation, through old age pensions, and through increased services for the protection of children and the prevention of ill health.
It's still around today, but it gets its start in 1935. The Social Security Administration's main objective was to help the poor elderly who should have been retired, but when banks failed in the 1930s, they lost everything. So instead of them having to go back to work, perhaps they're even maybe disabled at this point and can't go back to work. If you were 65 or older, Social Security would pay you a monthly check to help make ends meet. Now, it also extends to anyone who's disabled, so you could be younger than 65 but be blind, for example, and Social Security would kick in to help you out. It also extended to dependents of a spouse that may have passed. So if you're a widow or you are a child that depended on a working dad, you would be covered by Social Security and be getting these checks. So FDR is taking a lot of criticism at the time, and the conservative right is saying that he is creating a limited welfare state. He's verging on socialism, and the left is criticizing him in that he's not doing enough. He's not helping the elderly enough, the poor enough, minorities enough, unemployed people enough. So to go into a little bit more detail, let me introduce Huey Long. He was a governor of Louisiana and then the senator of Louisiana, and he believed that FDR wasn't doing enough to help with income inequality in America. So he promoted a Share Our Wealth program, which the idea here was to tax the wealthiest Americans a lot more and then use that revenue to make sure that every American family had at least $2,000 of annual income. It also included universal health care for all, free higher education for young people, and pensions for the elderly. Huey Long would have been a very legitimate contender to FDR in the 1936 presidential election had he survived to see it. He is assassinated in September of 1935. Another of these demagogues is a former physician named Dr. Francis E. Townsend. And Townsend is going to critique the New Deal on not doing enough for the elderly. He proposes the Townsend Plan, which is to do a 2% tax nationally on all products and use that new income to the federal government to give elderly citizens over 60 years old a $200 check every month. There is a stipulation to it, though. The $200 has to be spent within that month, otherwise it's gone. So theoretically, this would help the elderly make ends meet in retirement, but also help stimulate the economy because now they're forced to spend this $200 every month, buying things and propping up the economy. FDR steals Townsend's idea, though, and that becomes Social Security, essentially. Another criticism of the New Deal is that it did not do enough for minorities. So let's take African Americans, for example. Face value, the CCC looked great because it's hiring all these young men, and it did hire over 200,000 African American men. But on the CCC camps, they separated workers and segregated them in black and white camps. They also typically prioritize giving the jobs to white males over African American men. Another example is the Agricultural Adjustment Administration was cutting checks to farmers, but these checks were not making it to the sharecroppers and the tenant farmers who were African American. They were getting pocketed by the plantation owners or the owners of these farms, the landowners. Women, too, were often not directly prioritized in the work programs the government was making. Like, these were hiring people to build infrastructure. It was construction jobs, and a lot of times men were prioritized over women. The Supreme Court of the United States was also stepping on FDR's toes a little bit in that second New Deal phase. In 1935, they struck down the National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, as unconstitutional. A year later, they struck down the AAA, the Agricultural Administration Act. FDR is so upset with the Supreme Court that he comes up with a scheme, a Judicial Reorganizing Act that would allow him to appoint a replacement judge for each judge that is 70 and a half years old or older. There was a limit. He couldn't do more than 6 additional judges, so 15 judges total for the Supreme Court, but this enraged many American citizens and congressmen. It seemed like he was trying to meddle with the checks and balances of the judicial branch. However, in 1936 and 37, we start to see the Supreme Court shift and start to align with FDR. They support the Wagner Act. They uphold the WPA. Jokingly, that's called the switch in time that saved 9. All right, that's it for today. Thank you so much for listening. Have a great one.